With Kamala Harris now the frontrunner to replace Joe Biden as the Democratic Party's nominee for U.S. president, what do we know about the former prosecutor based on her 4 years as vice president? Kamala Harris has been a strong supporter of women's rights, consistently supporting abortion since her days in the Senate. She energized women and younger voters over the repeal of Roe versus Wade and supported legislation that would protect the right to abortion nationally. One of her mandates as vice president was to address the root causes of migration from Latin America. This includes poverty and violence in migrants' home countries. Last year, she announced some $950 million in pledges from private companies to support Central American communities. She's expected to stick largely to Mr. Biden's foreign policy playbook on issues such as China, Iran, and Ukraine. But Ms. Harris may strike a tougher tone with Israel over its operations in Gaza, given that she called for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza earlier this year. But here is the state of play. Ms. Harris has struggled with low approval ratings over the past 4 years. And polls show her faring little better than Mr. Biden would have against Donald Trump. But some analysts are convinced that she still has a good chance of winning.
I do believe Harris can win. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to be a sure thing right now. And she has a lot of work to do, but today was a very impressive day. Once Biden announced that he was stepping aside and then endorsed Harris, the fundraising for her today has just been phenomenal, record-breaking for the Democratic Party, as well as the total number of Democrats that have come out and endorsed her, backed her campaign.
And for more insight, Drew Thompson joins us live right here in the studio. He is a visiting senior research fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at the National University of Singapore. Well, thanks for coming in, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you for having me.
Now, earlier we spoke to our correspondent in Washington, and she says the biggest challenge for Ms. Harris is beating Donald Trump. Of course, Ms. Harris has yet to get her party's official nomination, or even if she does, in her campaign, she does not have the luxury of running as many people do when they campaign on a platform of change, given that she has been vice president for 3.5 years.
Yeah, she is still an incumbent, so that presents a dilemma for her. She also, I think, needs to appear to be loyal to President Biden, who has stepped aside for her and endorsed her very strongly. So that's, of course, a character issue that I think she needs to play upon as well. So she has a bit of a dilemma there. I think she also faces a bit of a dilemma in terms of how hard does she want to run a negative campaign against President Trump. It's very tempting to point out that she's the prosecutor and he's the felon. But I think most research shows that the American public does not like negative campaigning, and it doesn't generally work in elections. So I think she needs to carve her own path, looking at positive policy proposals that both build on the Biden administration's and her legacy, and then paints a picture for the future that Americans can all get behind. And I think by focusing on women's reproductive rights, for example, she's in a good position to do that.
Earlier, we were looking at she's likely to keep to the Biden playbook on issues such as China, Iran, Ukraine, North Korea. Inasmuch as foreign policy that's dictated by serving the interests of domestic policy, can Ms. Harris, on foreign policy, strike a note that might play in her favor should she get this nomination during her campaign?
Well, presidential campaigns generally are run on domestic issues. And I think the key domestic issues that they need to consider are continuing economic growth, employment. I think President Biden, as well as the candidate Harris, will also want to continue to appeal to blue-collar voters and unions, and play up on some of their economic successes that in some cases have gone somewhat unnoticed by the voters and haven't really given Biden all the credit I think he may deserve for some of the economic accomplishments. But that said, they also have to manage contentious economic issues such as inflation, which definitely works against the incumbent. So foreign policy generally is based on U.S. interests, and U.S. interests don't really change from cabinet to cabinet or from candidate to candidate or from party to party. So I think in terms of foreign policy towards Asia, I think we'll see a lot of continuity. I think should Vice President Harris get the nomination and become the elected president, she'll have a very steep learning curve on foreign policy. President Biden had a lifetime of experience doing foreign policy, deep relationships with leaders throughout the world, including here in Asia. And he really hit the ground running on foreign policy. And I think she's going to have to really step up and demonstrate to the voters that she can be conversant in these issues, knowledgeable about these issues, and actually try to develop some of the instincts that President Biden has had on foreign policy all along.
There's so many points to pick up on, but for now, let's just do just the one. So you're talking about many achievements, certainly even domestically on policy, accomplishments that somehow have not struck home with voters in the United States. Parallels earlier that we drew with Mr. Biden is not the same, because Lyndon B. Johnson pulled out voluntarily over unpopularity in foreign policy, an unpopular war specifically, despite doing well at home. Mr. Biden, what further parallels might you draw with this voluntary pullout from the presidential race?
So the Lyndon B. Johnson decision not to run for a second term was really quite historic, and Biden is the second candidate to do so. It really kind of reinforces the dilemma between getting domestic policy right and foreign policy wrong. It's worth remembering that LBJ stepped down in the middle of the Tet Offensive, which was going terribly in terms of public relations. The perception was that the U.S. was losing badly, but in fact, it was a military victory for the U.S. in the end. But it was deeply unpopular with the public. And I think that's perhaps a similar parallel or dilemma that the Democratic Party faces over Israel's war against Hamas, where young people, key constituents in important swing states within the Democratic Party certainly support a less aggressive policy, less support for Israel, faster pathways to peace. And that contrasts a bit with Biden's instinct, which has been to support U.S. allies, support Israel. So she faces a bit of a dilemma. She doesn't want to depart completely from Biden's policies. He's still the president for the next 6 months. And it's important to remember the election's a long time away. So while she's riding high today, she may face challenges next week.
All right. As we speak, because Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu headed to Washington to make sure he continues to get the kind of support he has got from Mr. Biden. And with it, Ms. Harris, you say a dilemma, she does confront a dilemma. Does she continue? Could she have a change in tone, as an example? There have been suggestions she might be perhaps more sympathetic to the Palestinian plight. Is that something she can make use of to appeal to, say, for example, the Arab American vote bank? Final question.
So I think it's going to be a challenge for her to appeal to the voters in a way that makes her look disloyal to President Biden. And I think this is a potential seam issue. I think it also potentially becomes an opportunity for the Republican Party to criticize her and heap some pressure on her for not supporting U.S. alliances, which is something that President Trump is often accused of. So in order to differentiate herself from Trump, she has to really consider how closely does she align herself with President Biden and unfortunately, some of his unpopular foreign policies.
Oh, thanks so much for joining us. Drew Thompson, visiting Senior Research Fellow at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, NUS. Thank you.